In the winter of 1879, 3 children walked out of the woods near Winfield, Kansas. They were barefoot. Their clothes were shredded. Their eyes were empty. When the local sheriff asked them where they'd been, the oldest child, a girl no more than 12, opened her mouth and said something that made grown men step backward. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She whispered, and what she whispered wasn't a place. It was a warning. The Winfield case is not a ghost story. It's not folklore. It's a documented incident buried in county records, church logs, and one very disturbing physician's journal that was sealed for over a century. The children were real. Their names were Margaret, Thomas, and Samuel Pruitt. And what they described, what they tried to explain in broken, halting words, didn't match anything human beings were supposed to know. This isn't about what happened to them. That part is obvious. This is about what they said happened, and why no one, not the town, not the church, not even their own parents, could look them in the eye afterward. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Because when children come back from somewhere and can no longer recognize their own faces in the mirror, when they flinch at the sound of their mother's voice, when they ask questions like, why does the sun make noise? And who taught us to forget? You don't ask what they saw. You ask what saw them. The Pruitt children were found on January 14, 1879, along the banks of the Walnut River, about 4 miles south of Winfield. They had been missing for 19 days. Search parties had combed the area. Dogs lost the scent. The river was frozen. The woods were silent. And then, on that morning, a farmer named Josiah Kern saw them standing in his field, not walking, standing, facing his house. He said later that they looked like they were waiting, not for him, for permission. The children were taken to the Winfield Parish Rectory. That's where Dr. Edmund Hartley examined them. He was the town's only physician, a man known for his meticulous records and steady hands. But what he wrote in his journal that night wasn't steady. It was frantic, incomplete. He crossed out entire paragraphs. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked nothing like his own, he wrote, "They remember something we were supposed to forget." Margaret, the eldest, had frostbite on her toes but showed no signs of pain. Thomas, age 9, had lost 2 fingernails. Samuel, the youngest at 6, had a fever that broke the thermometer, but none of them cried. None of them asked for their parents. When Dr. Hartley asked Margaret where they had been, she looked at him, not at his face but at his chest, as if she could see through him, and said, "We went to the place where the air doesn't move." He asked her what she meant. She said, "You know, everyone knows. They just don't say it out loud." The brothers didn't speak at all for the first 2 days. They sat on the floor of the rectory, backs against the wall, hands folded in their laps. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. When Reverend Collier tried to pray over them, Samuel looked up and said, "He's not listening." He never was. The town didn't know what to do. The parents, Jacob and Ruth Pruitt, were brought in, but the reunion was wrong. The children didn't run to them. They didn't embrace. Margaret stood when her mother approached and said very quietly, "You're different now." Ruth asked what she meant. Margaret said, "You used to be louder." Jacob Pruitt broke down. He fell to his knees and begged his children to tell him what happened. Thomas finally spoke. He said, "We were taught." Jacob asked who taught them. Thomas said, "The ones who have been here longer than the houses." Hartley's journal records that the children were kept in the rectory for 6 days. During that time, they began to draw, not pictures, symbols, patterns, lines that folded in on themselves, circles that didn't close, shapes that hurt to look at. When asked what they were drawing, Margaret said, "The way back." On the 7th day, the children were returned to their parents, but the town made a decision. It wasn't written down. It wasn't voted on. It was understood. The Pruitts were to leave Winfield, not because the children were dangerous, because the questions they asked were. Margaret had started speaking in full sentences again, but they were wrong. She would say things like, "The ground remembers where we walked," or, "There are more doors than walls if you stop counting." When her mother asked her to help with the washing, Margaret stared at the water and said, "It doesn't like being still." Thomas began sleepwalking, but he didn't walk through the house. He walked in perfect geometric patterns, circles, triangles, figure eights. His father would find him in the yard at 3 in the morning, barefoot in the snow, tracing invisible lines with his toes. When Jacob woke him, Thomas would look confused and say, "I was measuring." Samuel stopped eating bread. He said it tasted like clay. He stopped drinking from cups. He said the water was too loud. He would only drink from his cupped hands, and only if no one was watching. When Ruth asked him why, he said, "Because it knows when you're looking." The drawings continued. The children filled every scrap of paper in the house. They drew on the walls. They drew in the dirt. And the patterns, always the same patterns, started appearing in places they hadn't been. A neighbor found one carved into her fence. The school teacher found one scratched into the floorboards of the empty classroom. No one saw the children do it, but everyone knew. Dr. Hartley visited the Pruitt home on February 2nd. He wanted to examine the children one more time. What he found disturbed him more than anything he'd seen in the rectory. The children were sitting together in the corner of the main room, whispering to each other in a language he didn't recognize. When he asked them what they were saying, Margaret looked at him and said, "We're remembering the words from before words." He asked her what that meant. She said, "You'll understand when you stop pretending you don't." That night, Dr. Hartley went home and burned 4 pages of his journal. We know this because he wrote about burning them. He said he couldn't allow those particular observations to exist on paper. He said some truths are designed to spread, and once they're written, they don't stop being read, even by people who aren't there. The Pruitt family left Winfield on February 11, 1879. They didn't say where they were going. Jacob sold the house for 1/3 of what it was worth. The buyer was a man from Wichita who had never seen the property. He moved in 3 weeks later. He lasted 5 days. He told the town clerk that the house was wrong, not broken wrong. He said the rooms felt larger at night. He said he could hear children whispering in the walls, but when he pressed his ear to the plaster, the whispering moved to the room behind him. On the 5th night, he woke to find all the furniture pushed to the corners. Perfect right angles. He hadn't touched any of it. He left before dawn and never came back for his deposit. The house stood empty for 2 years. Then it burned. No one knew how. There was no lightning, no lanterns left lit. The fire started in the center of the structure and burned outward in a perfect circle. When the ashes cooled, they found the drawings, carved into the floorboards beneath where the children's room had been. Hundreds of them, layered on top of each other like something had been practicing. But the children, the Pruitt children, were never seen in Winfield again. The town moved on. The story faded, except it didn't. Not really, because in the spring of 1881, a family in Lawrence, Kansas, over 100 miles northeast, reported that their 3 children had gone missing. They were found 6 days later wandering along the Kansas River, barefoot, silent, and when the local doctor examined them, the oldest child, a boy, said something that stopped him cold. He said, "We went to the place where the air doesn't move." The doctor's name was William Shepard. He had never heard of the Pruitt case. Lawrence and Winfield didn't share newspapers. There were no telephones, no way for the story to travel. But the words were identical. Dr. Shepard wrote to a colleague in Topeka, asking if he'd ever heard of children describing a place like that. The colleague wrote back. He said yes, twice. Once in 1873 in Abilene, once in 1877 Council Grove. Both times children disappeared, both times they came back wrong, and both times they used the exact same phrase, "We went to the place where the air doesn't move." Dr. Shepard became obsessed. He began collecting reports, church requests, physician testimonies. What he found wasn't a pattern, it was a map. Between 1868 and 1895, there were at least 17 documented cases across Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, children disappearing for days or weeks, always in winter, always near rivers or wooded areas, and always, they came back speaking in that same quiet, hollow way, describing things that didn't have names, asking questions no child should know how to ask. In 1884, a girl in Omaha returned after 12 days and told her parents, "The trees were watching, but they don't have eyes." In 1889, 2 brothers in Jefferson City came back and refused to sleep in beds. They said beds were too high off the ground. They said you have to stay low or it sees you. In 1891, a boy in Salina wouldn't let his mother touch him. He said her hands felt like someone else's. But the Winfield case, the Pruitt children, remained the most detailed, because Dr. Edmund Hartley had written everything down. And in 1904, 25 years after the children were found, his journal was donated to the Kansas State Historical Society. It sat in an archive box for 73 years, unread, uncatalogued, until a graduate student named Claire Dannon found it in 1977. She was researching frontier medicine. She wasn't looking for this. But when she opened Hartley's journal and read the entry from January 1879, she said later that she felt her skin go cold. Not because of what the children said, because of what Hartley wrote at the very end. He said, "I have begun to see the patterns myself. In the frost on my window, in the way the fire burns, in the shape my shadow makes at noon. I do not believe the children brought something back. I believe they were shown something that was already here, and now I cannot stop seeing it." Claire Dannon spent 2 years trying to trace the Pruitt family. She found baptism records, a deed transfer, a single photograph from 1877 showing Jacob, Ruth, and 3 children standing in front of a wooden house. Margaret's face is blurred, not from motion. The plate was perfectly still. Her face is just missing, a smudge where her features should be. Claire found one more thing, a death certificate for Margaret Pruitt, dated November 1881, cause of death unknown, location a town called Parsons, Kansas. She was 14 years old. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Claire Dannon traveled to Parsons in 1979. The town records office had burned in 1923, but the cemetery was still there. She found Margaret Pruitt's grave in the northeast corner beneath a cottonwood tree. The headstone was small, no epitaph, just her name and the dates. But beneath the soil, something had been buried with her. Claire didn't dig, she didn't have to. The groundskeeper told her. He said that when Margaret was interred, the local minister insisted on placing iron nails around the coffin, 6 of them, driven into the earth at angles, forming a star. The groundskeeper's grandfather had been there. He said the minister wouldn't explain why. He just said, she asked for it. Margaret Pruitt requested iron nails around her own grave at 14 years old. She knew she was dying and she knew what had to be done. Claire tried to find Thomas and Samuel. She never did. No death certificates, no marriage records, no census entries after 1880. The brothers disappeared from history as cleanly as they had disappeared from the woods. But there were stories, unconfirmed, whispers in county archives and old church basements. A man matching Thomas's description was seen in 1903, living alone in the Flint Hills. A shepherd said he kept to himself, never spoke, and had covered every surface of his cabin in carvings. The same symbols, the same patterns. When the shepherd returned the following spring, the cabin was empty. The door was open, the carvings were gone, sanded smooth, as if someone had spent months erasing them. Samuel's name appears once more in a psychiatric hospital log from, say, a man named Samuel Pruitt, age 24, admitted for persistent delusion and self-isolation. The intake notes say he refused to face windows. He said the sky was looking for him. He was released 6 weeks later. No follow-up, no discharge summary, just a single sentence written by the attending physician. Patient shows no improvement but is no longer willing to speak. Release approved. Claire Dannon published her research in 1982. It was a small academic paper, fewer than 30 pages, titled Disappearance and Return: Child Trauma Narratives in the Post-Civil War Midwest. It was cited twice, both times in footnotes. The historical community ignored it. They said her sources were too anecdotal. They said she was drawing conclusions from coincidence. But one person read it carefully, a retired pastor in Kansas City named Leonard Ashford. He wrote to Claire in 1983. He said he had been a young minister in the 1950s, serving a rural parish near the Nebraska border, and one Sunday, an elderly woman came to him after the service. She said her grandmother had known the Pruitt family. She said her grandmother told her something before she died, a secret the town of Winfield had agreed never to speak. The children didn't walk out of the woods, they were carried. The woman's grandmother had been 11 years old in 1879. She lived on a farm 2 miles from where the Pruitt children were found. And on the morning of January 14th, she saw something her parents told her she must never repeat. She saw men carrying the children, not rescuing them, carrying them, like pallbearers, slow, deliberate, their faces pale. She said the men weren't speaking, they weren't calling for help. They were just walking in formation toward town, and the children weren't struggling. They were staring straight up at the sky, mouths open, eyes unblinking. Her father saw her watching from the window. He pulled her away. He told her she didn't see anything. He told her some things are too heavy to carry in your memory. He told her the men were trying to put something back. Not rescue something. Put it back. Leonard Ashford said the woman didn't know what that meant. Neither did he, but he said she told him one last thing before she left. She said her grandmother used to have nightmares. Every winter, always the same. She would dream she was walking through snow, following small footprints, and the footprints would lead her to a doorway, not in a building, just standing in the woods, a frame, a threshold. And on the other side, she could hear children singing, but the song wasn't made of words. It was made of breathing. Claire Dannon died in 1991. Her papers were donated to the University of Kansas. Most of them were cataloged. But her notes on the Pruitt case, her interviews, her maps, her photographs, were marked restricted access. No explanation given. They remain restricted to this day. Dr. Edmund Hartley's journal is still in the Kansas State Historical Society archives. You can request to view it, but you need permission. And according to the archivist who spoke to a researcher in 2003, fewer than a dozen people have ever asked. Of those, only 3 completed their viewing. The others left before finishing. When asked why, one of them said, "It wasn't what was written. It was what was sketched in the margins. I didn't want to keep looking. The house where the Pruitt children lived is gone. The land is now a parking lot behind a hardware store. But every few years, someone will mention it online, a local who grew up nearby, a historian doing research, and they'll say the same thing. They'll say that on certain winter nights, if you stand where the house used to be, you can hear something under the asphalt. Not footsteps, not voices, just a low hum, like the sound of a question being asked over and over, without breath. The Pruitt children were found in 1879. They tried to explain what happened, and what they said didn't sound human because maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe some doors opened from the other side. Maybe some things have been here longer than we have. Maybe we're the ones who forgot the words. And maybe, just maybe, there are still children walking out of the woods, trying to remember how to warn us. But we stopped listening a long time ago.